Okay. Alrighty. So I guess we can get started as they roll in. So let's continue. Alrighty. Thank you everyone who has joined. I am very appreciative of you all. I know I'm the last one today, so bear with me. I'll try to make this as fun as possible, as interactive as possible. But definitely thank you for making part of your day. I know this is the last presentation to get some information that I'll be providing.
So
my
yeah,
room monitor, would I just share my screen?
You're all good. I just want to say really quick 2 things. I will be the room monitor for this presentation. If y'all please ask you guys to just please mute yourselves so we just make sure less static and feedback so JJ can have his presentation without any interruptions today. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or save them to the Q&A portion at the end. Also, please make sure your full name is located at the top of your video, just to make sure, especially if you are a Chicago student, just to make sure we do get your attendance, okay? And JJ, you're free to take it from here.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you all can see it. Yes, can we see it?
Looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, alrighty. So let's get started. So the title of my presentation is called Black Boy Magic, examining the intersectionality of sexual minority men who are living with HIV. And this is just largely consideration for counselors, but also other practitioners in allied health fields. So a little about me. My name is John Jackson, but I prefer to be called JJ. Please call me JJ. John is my dad. I'm a Master of Arts candidate here in the online CMHC program, set to graduate in a couple months. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and it is an honor to be presented before you all on this topic. Alrighty. So just a description of the presentation. I won't read all this to you, but just to summarize it all up. So current discourse in counseling practices and recent literature often illustrates a proclivity to neglect sexual health within counseling evidence-based practices. So we have Black and brown, gay and bisexual men who are living with HIV are a minoritized group through their triple minority status. And by triple minority status, I mean they are affected by race, sexual orientation, and chronic disease. So this presentation will be underpinned by concepts of intersectionality and how that aids or potentially hinders congruence within this population. I will bring about and examine 2 mental and public health models, including Meyer's sexual minority stress model and the social determinants of health frameworks. And this presentation will support the de-stigmatization of mental health by offering a critical lens of current counseling practices in an attempt to offer more robust best practices. So I want to amend that and say this is just going to be largely an exploratory, high-level overview of the frameworks as well as the implications for counselors and public health professionals when dealing with sexual minority men who are living with HIV. And so further, again, that towards the end, this presentation will attempt to bridge together the medical and mental health fields, which have largely been considered in silos, by discussing a population that is that requires competent services from both fields. And if you have any questions, feel free to utilize the chat box so we can have a discussion about anything that comes up throughout the course of the presentation. So feel free to comment and ask questions or provide feedback as necessary. So learning outcomes. So these are just a couple of things that I hope you are able to take away. If even one thing, I would have accomplished what I set out to do when I did this presentation. So participants will be able to define intersectionality. Participants will also be able to give examples of triple minority status populations and how that affects help-seeking behaviors, coping mechanisms, and efficacy of protective factors. You all will be able to list at least 3 examples of social determinants of health. And participants will also be able to describe the importance of intersectionality as it relates to counseling best practices and interventions for sexual minority men living with HIV and AIDS. So intersectionality, this is the big word. So what exactly is it and what it is not? So for most people, we have a blanket understanding of what intersectionality entails, but not enough depth in order to fully converse about it or even understand the impact for minoritized populations. So I have a quote from Audre Lorde that says, "There's no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And to illustrate what is meant by her statement is this graphic towards the bottom that has so many different, it's a cluster of things. So we have ability, mental health, language, political affiliation, sexual orientation, nationality, age, culture, hobbies, education, marital status, and etc. So that in a nutshell is what intersectionality is. And the theory that is behind that asserts that people are often disadvantaged by the confluence and the convergence of multiple sources of oppression. So it could be their race, their class, their gender identity, their affectional orientation, their religion, and other identity markers. And it is further defined as the interconnected nature. So there is a interconnecting piece, there is a interwoven demonstration that happens between social categorizations, again, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, which is regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So to synthesize that into something more layman's terms, just consider, I like to use the metaphor, or not the metaphor, but the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle or constellations. So when we think, let me ask, why would I think jigsaw puzzles or constellations to explain intersectionality? Who would have a clue or a guess why we use one of those two items to explain this concept? You can put it in the chat box or you can mute yourselves, either or works.
Because there's many pieces that make up a person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not a trick question. That's exactly it. Thank you for that. And so when we think about jigsaw puzzles, we think about, you know, the box that we get them in. The box that we get them in is a matter of where did this client come from and what are the pieces that are inside this box that have to be put together to make this whole picture. Now, while the box is disassembled in various pieces, as we put the things together, it's still going to result in that same one picture, but it takes many, many, many pieces in order to put that picture together. Just like our clients and just like our patients, they come to us as a whole self, but as we dissect them, they are a conglomerate of various identities wherein they belong, which may not be apparent to the eye. And a constellation, you know, piecing together things that may seem vague, that may seem ambiguous, and then putting together to result into this picture that we didn't see before once we started to engender our relationships with them. So that's what I mean by intersectionality, and that's a more digestible way of conversing about this with your fellow clinicians. So as it relates to sexual minority men, their intersections illustrate an identity that's disadvantaged by the confluence of race, gender identity, affectional orientation, and living with a chronic disease. Now, these disadvantages are further exacerbated when there is an inclusion of HIV, which is a highly stigmatized and chronic disease as an intersection. So as promised, these are two of the theoretical underpinnings that I'll be briefly highlighting just to bring about some salience and some relevance to the topic at hand. So we have Meyer's minority stress model and the social determinants of health. So for Meyer's minority stress model, his model represents the most plausible explanation for sexual orientation disparities in mental and behavioral health. So as it stands across mental health disciplines, we refer to minority stress model as far as the stigma-related stress to which sexual minority individuals, such as gay and bisexual men of color, are disproportionately exposed as a result of their devalued social status. So within this model is inclusive of stress processes, including the experiences of prejudice events, expectations of rejection, hiding and concealing, internalized homophobia, and coping processes. So essentially, minority stress theory describes it's almost like the constellation. It's like, where is that minority person socially? So where are they stratified as for as class, where are they stratified as for as socioeconomic status, where are they stratified as for as education, family dynamics, again, that social placement and positioning of sexual minorities, which after chronic engagement and emergence results in health-related conditions and often comorbid behaviors, such as mental disorders, psychological distress, physical disorders, health behaviors, example given, smoking and condom use, and more generally, a sense of well-being. And to define a little bit further, minority stress resides in stigmatizing social structures that perpetuate stigma and discrimination across workplaces, schools, religious institutions, neighborhoods, and families. So again, it's a systemic view as well, just as much as it is an individual level thing. So if, let's say, a gay Black male, if he resides socially, and if he is socially placed towards the lower end of every spectrum as far as low socioeconomic status, he has a lack of social supports, he has less education than his counterparts, then that would affirm the influx or the possibility for the prevalence of mental health disorders. And so this is the graphic. So this is want to illustrate, this is his actual model. So just to walk through briefly, we have circumstances in the environment. So what is going on inside that person's environment? What is going on inside for sexual minority men, where they live, where they reside? What is happening that's going to start the course for the stress to be engendered? So we go to B, their minority status, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, and gender. And then depending upon which one is more overt, then they move to what type of stressor is it? So is it one that is distal, is it one that's macro level, or is it one that's proximal, which is one that is micro? So with micro, those are usually those interpersonal relationships that we have from day to day with our social others. You know, when we go to a birthday party, or when we're around family, or when we go to work, when we go to school, those are the proximal minority stress processes that may come about. And for micro or the distal minority stress processes, it's the higher level. What are the socio-political implications for me being a sexual minority man? And how is that being demonstrated as far as legally, like what laws are there that may prohibit full expression of my identity as a sexual minority man and things of that nature. And all of this is going to be reaffirmed by either for positively or negatively by coping and social support. So if there's a high level of social support within their communities, then all things equal, it should relate to a minimization of minority stress. And vice versa, if there is a high level of social support, a lack of social support, then there would be an increase of how badly one feels minority stress. So going to social determinants of health is a largely public health informed model. And within the context of, and it's usually used within the context of describing HIV. So, and why HIV? Because it is a public health crisis that is overrepresented among Black and Latino men who have sex with men. And to understand this occurrence, social determinants of health as a framework considers that individuals are multiple, they're multifaceted, they're varied, but it may bring about interrelated diseases and social conditions while also explaining racial disparities. So they feed off one of another. And further, social determinants of health is a public health understanding of the various structural, social, and biological factors that interact within the context of social placement and social positioning as it pertains to vulnerability to HIV among Black and Latino men. So I know I've been talking a lot. So I wanted to ask, what examples could you give? And again, this icon over here delineates 6 of the high impact social determinants of health. We have economic stability, healthcare, neighborhood and environment, education, and social and community context. So what are some more examples of social determinants of health that you all can think of? If not, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. So just to give
housing, maybe. I mean, maybe that goes in with neighborhood, but.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Housing is one. What else? Let me give y'all a hint. Let me give y'all a hint. So these are some examples. So income level, educational opportunities, like you said, Jen, housing as well. Do I have access to safe housing? If I do have access to housing, is it stable? What are my neighborhood conditions? You know, is it one that is not as affirming as other places that may be a geographical implication? What are the crime rates? And again, are those crime rates against those who are sexual minorities? Do I have access to safe drinking water? Do I have any food insecurity? Is there equity in the workplace? So these are just examples of social determinants of health. So any little thing that may impact the life experience of a minoritized population is a social determinant of health, because it essentially is going to determine the health outcomes across the board: mental health, physical health, emotional health, and etc. So for Black sexual minority men who are living with HIV and AIDS, the mental health disparities are one that has been heavily documented in literature. But just to go over a couple, rates of depression among men who have sex with men are consistently higher than those among the general adult male population, ranging from 15 to 26%, as compared to the 5 to 12% of the general population, of the general adult male population. So we're seeing almost triple the rate and of incidence and prevalence for rates of depression among men who have sex with men who are of color. And mental health disorders play a critical role in HIV acquisition. So we see that mental health is also informed by public health. So if a person is experiencing mental health issues and problems, then that serves as a risk factor for risky sexual health behaviors as a mechanism to cope with a minoritized identity, which may result in HIV acquisition. So it feeds from mental health all the way over to public health. And then going over to public health disparities, HIV/AIDS, of course, is of disproportionate impact, prevalence, and incidence when referring to sexual minority men. And given the disproportionate HIV and sexually transmitted disease burden among men who have sex with men, they constitute 53% of new HIV/AIDS infections in the United States and 72% of all men living with HIV. So we see a very, again, is heavily documented, is highly reported as far as Black sexual minority men represent the focal point of sexual health and public health. And mental disorders, as we know, can present a substantial barrier to adequate engagement and retention in HIV primary care. Because if a person, if there's a Black gay male that does not have adequate housing or has like has comorbid mental health disorders, his priority is not going to be thinking about, am I going to be able to make it to my appointment? His thought process is going to be, what food am I going to eat tonight? Where am I going to sleep tonight? So that affects engagement and retention into HIV primary care. So there's a quote by James Baldwin, and he said, "A Black gay person who is a sexual conundrum to society is already, long before the question of sexuality comes into it, menaced and marked because he's Black or she's Black," he said. "The sexual question comes after the question of color. is simply one more aspect of danger in which all Black people live. So if we think historically, African-American individuals have largely felt the brunt of social extrication across the board. So if we reframe this in the context of mental and public health, we also see that disparity still remains. So a person who is engaged with a system who's African-American already on the basis of race is at a disadvantage when compared to their counterparts. So if you add more minoritized or marginalized identities, then that's going to relate, or that's going to illustrate a further disadvantage and exacerbate mental health symptoms and outcomes. So what are some of the implications for counseling and other fields? And I want you all to chat as well while I go over this. So sexual minority men, they occupy a social status that is impacted by the service delivery of mental and public health because they are living with HIV, so they must see their HIV primary care doctor, they must see their physician, they must see their nutritionist, but also from the data that I've shown, they also have a prevalence or a higher incidence of mental health disorders. So at some point, they must engage with mental health clinicians. So public health professionals and mental health clinicians should not operate in silos but offer one another because they should be informed by the other and know that they have clients who may come to their practices that are impacted by other systems. So for counselors in particular, it's important to demonstrate cultural competence, not just counselors, but public health professionals when working with this population. Now we assume because someone works in mental health or we assume someone works in public health, oh, you know all there is to know about marginalized populations, and that's not the case. And so it is necessary for all practitioners to develop that strong therapeutic relationship with their clients in order to prevent a lack of retention in mental and public health. And again, just be mindful of the consistent and chronic exposure to heteronormative messaging. So many systems in our society today is tailored towards heteronormativity, which is not necessarily appeasing to, but necessarily illustrating that the binary male, one man with one woman as the dominant culture and as the dominant discourse, when in reality people have varying affectional orientation and gender identities. But the impact of consistent messaging impacts efficacy of protective factors and results in an increase of risk factors. And the stigma of HIV and AIDS is not the same as the stigma of cancer or diabetes. The reason why is because HIV and AIDS is more sexualized. If a person is living with cancer, although very unfortunate and chronic for some people, or diabetes, HIV/AIDS is held to a different regard because there is an fixed social population, which unfortunately is sexual minority men, even though in lieu of biomedical research, it's actually shown that HIV and AIDS, anyone can acquire that. But for some reason, when it started out, it was noted as the gay gene, and it was just only a chronic ailment meant for those who identified as a sexual minority, which is not the case. But understanding the history of HIV and AIDS will also be able to better inform and equip clinicians when working with this unique population. So some recommendations for practitioners: seek to be trauma informed. Many sexual minorities in some way have already engendered some form of trauma, which, as we know as clinicians in the field, critically impacts mental health outcomes and the efficacy of coping mechanisms. There has been an identification of a couple primary behavioral interventions that may improve the mental and sexual health of sexual minority men living with HIV. So we have cognitive restructuring and emotional regulation may be useful, as well as highlighting the systemic disparities that may occur for future generations. And also understanding that the role stigma, prejudice, and heteronormativity, rejection, and internalized homophobia play in fueling HIV and substance use among gay and bisexual men is also necessary. So what could we do as clinicians? For one, we can expand our intake forms, our biopsychosocial assessments to be inclusive of previous systemic engagement. And there are some biopsychosocial assessments and tools that are kind of outdated, and they don't ask for, like, is a person with HIV, if they decide to disclose, or do they have a chronic health condition? And when we see those marked, sometimes we don't really actually consider it. So we definitely want to be more mindful of, this person may be living with HIV and AIDS, but not just HIV and AIDS, but any chronic condition or any health condition will impact how a person perceives counseling, how a person perceives public health, and how a person is able to sustain or remain in those various services. For clinicians, attend psychoeducational forums, webinars, conferences surrounding intersectionality and minority stress. Practice continuous introspection, reflection, and minimizing your biases. So some people may come from religious backgrounds that are not largely LGBT affirming. And even though you may not ascribe to religion, there are still some implications for those who may be Christian. And so largely some sexual minorities have had a conflict, especially those who live with HIV, with religion and spirituality. So being mindful of those intersections and where you fall, and how that may either privilege or oppress someone. Also for clinicians to just increase clinical capacity in both public and mental health. For instance, utilizing for counselors postmodern forms of therapy, like narrative therapy, which has been highly linked to higher levels of positive mental health outcomes for sexual minorities. So allowing the client to tell their story, allowing the client to dissect themselves, allowing the client to see themselves as a jigsaw puzzle, but also talking you through or walking you through their lived experiences, and giving that client that power that's not taken away from them, but oftentimes it's taken away from them in the form of systemic oppression. And for public health professionals, just expand surveillance and discourse to be inclusive of minority stress and how that impacts sexual behavior. And again, reframing counseling from being a silo discipline to one that has interdisciplinary impact. So just as our clients are multifaceted and we encourage them to explore themselves, our profession is as well. So the meaning behind the title. So Black Boy Magic, why, what does intersectionality, public and mental health have to do with Black Boy Magic? So the reason I titled this Black Boy Magic is due to the fact that when we think about Black Boy Magic, well, when I think about Black Boy Magic, I think about just an increase of protective factors. If a Black boy feels affirmed and feel as though he has an increase of protective factors, or feel that he is safe and feel that he is able to utilize effective coping skills, then that's magic, in the sense of it's going to combat and it's going to integrate their intersecting identities and better prepare them if they do have a occurrence of mental health issues or public health issues. Then the navigation of those systems won't be as tedious as a person who does not have access to those sources. Alrighty, now that I talked your heads off, and there was a lot of clinical words that were used. It was very content heavy, but if there's anything that anybody has as far as questions, we can definitely ask those at this time. Put them in the chat box. Any comments, feedbacks, additional remarks from anyone? Going once?
So JJ, I'm guessing maybe can you explain a little bit more about how I guess you came across, like you came to want to present this topic?
Yeah, sure, of course. Let me stop sharing my screen. Alrighty. So yeah, I come largely from a mental health background, and I fell into public health about 3 years ago. And I saw that we had like some literature, we have like some evidence-based practices for, let's say, someone who is white and is suffering from borderline personality disorder. Like, we have specified treatment for certain mental health occurrences, but it was like a lack of connection between what about other systems. So it could be criminal justice. What about somebody that's impacted by public health? And for me, I love the intersection between mental and public health. And I know that they feed off one another, but the literature is not really informing counseling-based practices as a field. So there's nothing specific to a person who's living with HIV. Do we have a explicit counseling modality that will better serve them and keep in mind their intersecting identities, for lack of a better word?
Thank you. And we also got a question from Jennifer in the chat. How can counselor educators ensure counselors in training learn about the importance of competencies in this area?
That is a great question. Thank you, Jennifer, for that question. And, you know, again, it's just some of the sentiments that I said before. It's continuous introspection. You know, our clients are going to come to us in various states. It may be in moments of crises. It may be just after grief. It may just be after a move. It could be after a divorce. But all of those things are underpinned, and the reactions to those things are underpinned by their health conditions, you know, the sexual behaviors. How do you cope? You know, how do you deal with grief? How do you process loss? And I think just a matter of counselor educators being mindful of just intersectionality and pushing intersectionality, because if you address intersectionality, you will hit, you know, triple, like, you will hit the understanding of what minority means. You'll hit the understanding of what it means to be an oppressed minority group. But I think we need to just push the conversation a bit further as far as when a person who is minoritized come into my office, how are they marginalized? And just ask more questions as far as like their external, like their macro environment, like where do you live, where do you reside? Is it rural? Is it urban? Do you have any previous system engagements? Just being mindful of just the question as well. Alrighty. Any more comments, any questions or feedback from anyone?
Great presentation. I definitely enjoyed it, JJ. That was amazing. Definitely got a lot of it, just a lot of information from it, that even though, you know, most of the people that have, you know, been through this program and seeing, getting to really dive deep into intersectionality, it's a difficult concept to not kind of grasp, because it really is so many levels to it. So you definitely did a really great job of explaining that.
Thank you. Yeah, and very important comments as well. And also, I just wanted to mention, you know, when we think about intersectionality, just do your best to just be aware and just be mindful. So the more questions you ask, the more you get to uncover that person. So just remember the jigsaw puzzle, the constellation, and think this client is more than what meets the eye. You know, they have something that is behind them. They have a culture. They have a family. They have where, you know, where they reside is important. So yeah, I definitely agree. Thank you for your comments.
There's another question. How did you find that this demographic is open to therapy, and how would you navigate closed-minded clients?
Okay, yeah, that is that's a very good question. So just coming from mental health, and actually currently in both fields at the same time now, I do find that clients are open to utilizing services. It's just the awareness of services, and it's just the mindfulness of those individuals. Like, do they see, because, and again, stigma is real and stigma is a thing. And for Black sexual minority men, the only time I have ever seen resistance is just when somebody was not affirming, was just not aware, and they use outdated language. So language use is important. And if a person is demonstrating resistance, it's just that It's just stigma. It's stigma. It's stigma. And you know, even though, and then they go from one system to the next, and then that there's no consistency between systems, which is why this bridging is kind of important. Because when a person leaves my counseling office, they may be going to write to their HIV doctor, and the doctor may not relay the same continuity of care as far as language and being affirming as it was with the counselor, and then it may cause the person to view all systems the same way. So the only time I've seen resistance and a lack of plan engagement is when providers are not affirming or not using the right language, and still resorting to like stigmatizing language. And I think the second part of your question was how we navigate closed-minded clients. Now, there will be some clients who are just closed-minded and not open to that, I'm assuming, therapy. And in that instant, again, just try to utilize postmodern forms of therapy. I found much success with that, and in particular, narrative therapy, because I'm literally just allowing the client, you tell me about yourself. You tell me how you have been oppressed. You tell me how you felt you've been marginalized. You tell me, as a Black man living with HIV in America, what do you feel are your strongest barriers? What do you feel? Do you have any social support system? You know, let them put that puzzle piece together in front of me. And as I watch them put it together, I ask questions, I inquire, and then we start to reframe if any cognitive distortions come out. And you know, that's how we navigate that piece as well.
This is how it looks like when I join a meeting.
And you mentioned narrative therapy as being conducive. Are there any other theories that are preferred for this demographic? Yes, anything that's dealing with cognitive restructuring or reframing, because they're going to come with, most will come with underlying negative health, not negative health, but negative self schemas, and just how they perceive people to perceive them. And they're going to bring that to counseling. And then as a counselor, you hold some position of power and privilege in the sense that they may see you as just another system that's just going to not be as affirming. So CBT, DBT, again, the postmodern forms of therapy, being person-centered. And before we do all of that, just seek to develop a rapport. Because, you know, most times sexual minorities may feel like people are just trying to get something out of them, or just trying to be, you know, like there's a pity party. But no, that's not the case. You just seek to build rapport, go back to the basics, build that therapeutic alliance, give them space, permission to breathe, to emote, to express like we would do any client, but be mindful that this client has seen just another system that may not be expressing that same consistency as far as how they approach these clients. Alrighty. Any more questions, comments? How have people, do you feel like if, well, let me ask you all a question. What theories do you think would be helpful for a population that is triply minoritized by race, affectional orientation, and chronic disease? What would you all use as a modality to work with these clients?
One of my favorite ones that I definitely have seen, especially with working with just the Black community in general, and understanding how, as my community, that's, you know, that's something that we really deal with, especially when it comes to counseling. A lot, you know, we have our generational stigmas against ourselves in a way. So definitely something I have come across for theories are compassion focused. Things that kind of allow you to have those feelings, emotionally focused and compassion focused, that allow you to have those feelings, that it's okay, even though when you were brought up, it might have not been okay for people to express those as openly as, you know, others have.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. I had a comment that said, honestly, I believe empowerment would be beneficial. And someone said ACT, yeah, acceptance and commitment therapy. And again, and these are things that we already know, is just to continue to be mindful. And, you know, not, you know, and it's not to say, you know, every person that comes to you just think are living with HIV and AIDS, but just approach them in the sense that, hey, they have engendered or may have seen or been impacted by another system that is not mental health related. So it's not to be considered mental health in silos, but understand that, hey, this person may have other health issues going on. Just be mindful of the of the influence of chronic disease and how they may impact race and how they cope and how they deal with stigma. Very, very important. Very, very important. Well, all right. I know I'm the last person. I won't keep you all late, but if there's no further questions, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat box for anyone to contact me with any questions or want a copy of the PowerPoint or anything like that.
This was awesome, JJ.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you.
All
You all
right.
stay safe
Thank
and
you.
take care.
Jennifer, would I just stop the recording now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And I did record to the cloud, so we should be good.
Awesome. Thank
Awesome.
you.